Welcome, everyone. I'm Tita Chico, Professor of English and Faculty Director at the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. Welcome to our final event in our year-long series on anti-racism. This is, I'm so delighted to say, our series finale, and it couldn't be better. We have convened this series, this year-long series on anti-racism, to act on statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter that were issued by the university, the college, and the department. Black Lives Matter. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. Black Lives Matter. With this series, we also celebrate and we also honor the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young Black man who was about to graduate from Bowie State University in May 2017 when he was murdered at a campus bus stop. The University of Maryland, that's our institutional home, and the University of Maryland was built in the mid-19th century on the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. The University of Maryland, our institutional home, was built in the mid-19th century through wealth extracted from enslaved Black men, women, and children. The first trustees were slavocrats. 80 years later, Thurgood Marshall was refused entry into the law school. The 1850 and 1860 census documents 12 members of the Adams family in 4 households adjacent to campus, a Black family. And Adam Francis Plummer was an enslaved Black man owned by the founder of the university, Charles Benedict Calvert. Adam Francis Plummer was his stepnephew. And Adam Francis Plummer, he left us his diary. Historical records demand our full critical attention, but they also demand our full creative attention. They demand stories. In our 1993 Nobel Prize lecture, Toni Morrison taught us that narrative is not merely entertainment, but one of the principal ways we absorb knowledge. The 12 members of the Adams family living next to campus, Adam Francis Plummer, the stepnephew, what were their interior lives? What are their stories? Sometimes those stories come to us. As our guest today, the novelist Andrea Lee opens her new novel, Red Island House. Sometimes those stories come to us in houses that you don't want, that nevertheless enter your life and bring with them other lives. The Center's Anti-Racism series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries, the Graduate School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and today's event is also co-sponsored by the Petrue Foundation and the Africana Black Studies Colloquium. With the support, we're able to commit to making everything accessible, and you'll find the link for live captioning in the chat. I want to thank the Center's graduate assistants, Danielle Griffin and Liam Daly. And I want to thank very specially and very warmly, especially on our series finale, the Center's co-director and director of research initiatives, Dr. Karen Nelson. Our program will last an hour. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Distinguished University Professor of English at the University of Maryland, Mary Helen Washington, and to my other colleague, Professor Shaun Myers from the University of Pittsburgh, who's also a Maryland PhD. Please join me in welcoming them. And if you would unmute your microphones, thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Welcome, a special welcome to Andrea Lee, to Maryland and to our university, and hello to Professor Shaun Myers. Just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land today, this is a 2-part introduction to Andrea Lee's work. I will begin with the personal account of my journey with her work, and Shaun then will continue by looking at specific pieces of her fiction. We will then turn the floor over to Andrea Lee, who will read some from her work. And following that, we will have a Q&A, and we ask you to send in your questions. So in the spirit of Andrea Lee's work that is always full of bizarre twists, I will introduce Andrea Lee first as mother and then as writer. In 1996, Lee took her 11-year-old daughter to visit an elite girls' prep school in Philadelphia to look over the middle school curriculum. The very same school where, in 1966, 30 years before, Lee had been the school's first Black student. She fictionalized her experience of that school integration in the story Servant Problems, which first appeared in the New Yorker and then became one of the chapters in her 1984 novel, Sarah Phillips. This novel captured the experiences of the dream children of the civil rights movement, those of us who were supposedly the beneficiaries of civil rights and integration. I was captivated by this novel because it so powerfully mirrored the experience of those like me who came of age in the 1950s. We were integrating mostly white schools, rejecting our middle-class parents to get afros, experimenting with interracial dating, finding our way into international travel, and struggling over issues of civil rights and Black power. But integration also meant being cut off from the social life of mostly white schools. It sometimes meant being ignored by teachers and traumatized by the experience of otherness. As we see in Sarah Phillips, it was not always a pretty story. After that 1996 school visit, Lee published a brief autobiographical sketch in the New Yorker called Back to School, in which she wrote that she was both disarmed and delighted by what she saw at her old school. Black, Asian, and white students mingling easily together, being greeted by a Black teacher wearing braids, a curriculum that featured dozens of works by Black, by Native American, Asian, and Hispanic writers, the walls lined with posters celebrating African American artists and scientists. And then there was this final miracle. A young Black woman was the director of her middle school. But when Lee tries to remind her daughter of her history there, her dreams of burning the school down, the daughter is impatient with all of this race talk. Daughter says to mother, "Can't you just forget about that?" Of course, Lee did not forget. She has spent more than 30 years exploring issues of integration, racial identity, Black expatriatism, and the experiences of women around the entire globe. She is one of those writers who is giving us new narratives about race, gender, and national identity. Narratives that inevitably provoke both pleasure and discomfort. Let me give you an example of the critical commentary, at least one piece of a critical commentary that her work provoked. Lee's depiction of Black middle-class culture led to a debate between Valerie Smith, then at Princeton, now the president of Swarthmore College, and me writing in the Women's Review of Books, and Smith later writing in an introduction for an edition, reprint edition of Sarah Phillips. Full disclosure, I took the view that Lee's work did not provide the political and racial critique that we have come to expect in African American literary traditions. Smith, who is a generation younger than I am, as well as all of my graduate students, took the view that Lee's work illuminates the contemporary moment in African American and African diaspora literary culture, that it produces a vision of African American identity not bound to US-based racial tropes, that it's work that challenges every notion we have of a fixed, stable African American racial identity, and that it forces us to challenge those traditional canons. Well, we see those challenges in all of her work. In her second novel, Lost Hearts in Italy, published in 2006, and in her collection of short stories, Interesting Women, published in 2002, she represents the lives of women of color living as expatriates in Italy, Africa, the West Indies, as they try out and invent new identities in foreign spaces. When I met Andrea in 2015 in Detroit, she told me that her next novel would be about foreigners living in Madagascar, a place that she said would allow her to explore the culture clashes between American, African American, and African cultures. That novel, of course, is Red Island House, published just a few weeks ago, which features a protagonist who, like Lee herself, is an African American literature professor, married to an Italian, living in Italy, and vacationing in Madagascar. So over the years, I've come to think of Lee as a global integrationist. When some scholars are predicting the death of African American literature, her transformative imaginings are creating the excitement in Black literary studies. Her fiction signals an evolution of African American diaspora and American canons, and rather than signaling an end, her work is reshaping those canons, allowing us to see the complexities of race, gender, and nation, and exemplifying the ways that Black writers continue to expand, to modernize, and to postmodernize Black experience. Lee puts her characters on trains, planes, and yachts, in luxury hotels, and at immigration checkpoints, in spaces that make us confront the ways that mass production, international capitalism, and multinational corporations are commercializing and commodifying culture and space the world over. So let me end by reading the final paragraph in Sarah Phillips, because I think it so wonderfully describes Sarah's response to this brave new world. So this is Sarah speaking. I had a brief new impression that the world was a place full of kids in transit, bound on excursions that might end up being glorious or stupid or violent, but that certainly moved in a direction away from anything they had ever known. I was one of them. And although I didn't know what direction I was heading in and had only a faint idea yet of what I was leaving behind, the sense of being in motion was a thrill that made up for a lot. I think this is the perfect description of how to read Andrea Lee's work. Adjust to the speed and enjoy the thrill of being in motion. I now turn it over to Professor Myers.
Having come of age in the late 1980s, nothing's probably shaped my life more than that many-headed and elusive thing we've come to know as racial integration. I was raised in the squarely middle-class suburb of Cleveland Heights, Ohio, by parents who had relocated from Louisiana for new jobs after proudly graduating from HBCUs. My life then bears the marks of their so-called integration and mine, marks of promise and alienation. Once, when my best friend and I were biking through our neighborhood, we rode by the house of one of the teachers at our elementary school, a white woman. We stopped to talk, but all I remember of the conversation is that she casually told us that her friends kept asking her why she hadn't yet moved out of our neighborhood because Black people were moving in. This was my first glimpse of the thing called white flight. I first encountered Andrea Lee's novel, Sarah Phillips, in a graduate course with Helen Washington. The scenes of the Black protagonist in and out of place at the Black church her father pastored and at the private school for girls she integrated recalled my own kinds of belonging and unbelonging. Lee's first book, the travelogue Russian Journal, became a cornerstone of my dissertation on Black writers like Langston Hughes, Erna Brauber, and Lee, whose depictions of global travel, I argued, imagine modes of social intimacy alternative to US racial integration. As a former newspaper journalist in New York and Boston, I was drawn to Lee's earliest work in The New Yorker. And my current research tells the story of how Lee, Jamaica Kincaid, and Charlene Hunter Galt, the periodical's first Black regular staff writers, integrated the magazine, altering not only the voice, but also the grammar of its signature column, The Talk of the Town. As a professor, I've taught Sarah Phillips just about every semester, often turning to Lee's novel after reading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and its epic reclamation of kinship. My students and I can't help but linger over the taught episodes in the life of Sarah, a 20-year-old who moves to Paris in the 70s in an effort to, quote, cast off kin, end quote, but also country. Certain scenes unsettle us. In the opening chapter, Sarah and her 3 white male roommates play a game in which she stands, quote, naked on a box and turns slowly to have her body appraised and criticized by the 3 French boys, end quote. The game, called Galatea, refers to Greek myth, but it also makes another allusion to the figure of the enslaved Black woman on the auction block. My students and I are left to ponder the uses and limits of Sarah's irreverence. We also dwell on the chapter Servant Problems, depicting an adolescent Sarah, newly enrolled in Prescott School for Girls. 7th grade Sarah is the only Black presence at the school, except for its cooks and maids. When she and a friend trespass to the school's top floor and come across a Black maid sitting in her closet-sized bedroom off a bare board corridor, they, quote, plunge down the stairs as if we'd seen a crime, end quote. Meditating on her exclusions from life at Prescott, Sarah recalls a photograph. Classes were easy for me, but friends were hard. A few years earlier, I'd seen a picture of a Southern Black girl making her way into a school through a jeering crowd of white students, a policeman at her side. Prescott didn't jeer at me. It had, after all, invited me, but it shut me off socially with a set of almost imperceptible closures and polite rejections. Sarah refers, it seems, to a photograph of 6-year-old Ruby Bridges' desegregation of a New Orleans elementary school in 1960. Save for her northern locale, her privilege, and the absence of white mobs, Sarah doubles the little girl captured in the iconic picture in ways that we all, meaning Black children, have doubled this scene at some point, at some time in the wake of civil rights. It is through this juxtaposition of Ruby Bridges, Sarah, and ourselves then that we can begin to cultivate something like empathy for rather than estrangement from the older Sarah who will place herself on a box in Paris. Against my scholarly impulse to just sit with the bitter truth of Sarah's post-civil rights alienation, with each rereading of this chapter, I quietly wish for 11-year-old Sarah, a girl just 2 years older than my own daughter, something other than separateness and isolation, something gesturing toward what Fred Moten theorizes as the Black solo. Meditating on another iconic photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, 15 years old, desegregating Little Rock Central High School in 1957, Moten reads Eckford as the Black soloist, who is backed by an unseen ensemble, a collective, a community. He writes, Eckford's untitled non-performance at Little Rock Central is consent not to be a single being. In place of the scene of Sarah plunging down the stairs at the sight of the Black maid, I have imagined an invitation and then her entry into the Black woman's room. Published some 40 years after Sarah Phillips, the Red Island House may just open up space for such possibilities. With genuine delight, I now welcome, on behalf of us all, Andrea Lee.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. And it's really interesting, as always, to hear someone else talking about something that I created. You know, it's things that I barely remember, but that are part of me. I was really, I'm just thrilled to hear, I don't hear any kind of discussion of the books that I've read earlier. And it helps me to see into what I've done and what I want still to do. So one thing that Mary Helen said is that she said that I was a professor of literature, but that's absolutely not true. I actually am just a writer, just a journalist and a writer. And so I don't really spend a lot of time, now that I'm out of graduate school, analyzing literature. I just try to write it and, you know, pick up what I can to create what I can. So I just want to make that clear. So in any case, I have this new book, and I think it fits in a lot with what I have always done all of my life, which is to write about different ways of being foreign, different ways of different ways of looking at cultures that collide, and that is Red Island House. So without further ado, I just want to read you part of the beginning of it, and then we can just start to talk about it and discuss. So this is the very opening of Red Island House, which is set in Madagascar on an imaginary island called Narantrani, which actually in Malagasy means wounded country, which is kind of important for the whole circuit of the book. And I'll just start reading for you. This first chapter is called The Packet War, and it opens with a quotation from the national epic of Madagascar, which is called Ebonia, and which is really quite ancient. I am a big house seen from afar. Not even a whole crowd can take it apart, but if they do, it takes revenge. And when those from across the sea catch sight of me, I add them to my servants. The Packet War. There are houses you don't want that nevertheless enter your lives and bring with them other lives, whole other worlds. There are countries you visit that lay hold of you and don't let go, even if you diligently attempt to remain a tourist. These thoughts have been incubating in the mind of Shea Sena ever since she, a Black American woman with scant interest in the continent of Africa, except as a near mythical motherland, unexpectedly and unwillingly became mistress of the Red House, a sprawling household in northwestern Madagascar. It is because of the big house and its bad fortune that she is at present in a dreamlike situation, hurrying under the calescent subequatorial sun through the back lanes of a fisherman's shantytown on the island of Narantrani in pursuit of a tiny Sakalava girl in a white satin gown. In the light-soaked stillness of the hottest noontime hour, when mongrel dogs lie flat as puddles in patches of shade, the barefoot child, who looks like an eerie carnival figure in that glaring white dress with its flounces and ribbons, skips in and out of sight through a maze of tottering bamboo huts. Occasionally, she turns her little braided head and makes a cheeky beckoning motion with a spindly brown arm as she guides Shea and Shea's head housekeeper, Bertine Lagrande, to the house of the man referred to, usually in whispers, as the neighbor. The tall, stately Bertine, also barefoot, also Sakalava, leads the way. Dressed in a sweeping print lamba, her geometrically knotted hair hidden by a big, sun-faded newsboy hat that gives her a curiously regal air, she chuckles softly each time the small white apparition of the child flashes into sight, then treads on casually as if engaged in an everyday errand. Shea stumbles along in her wake, hampered by the long skirt she was told to wear and hobbled as well by her American common sense, which is struggling with the awareness that she has crossed a threshold into the deep unknown. Her woven shoulder bag, concealing a wad of Ari bills and the small gift that Bertine suggested, bangs against her side as she tries not to think of the fact that she is seeking out the neighbor, a notorious conjure man, in hopes that he can lift the spell on her house. How has this peculiar quest come about? You could say it is because of something else that hasn't come about. The housewarming ceremony that Shay's husband Senna, a rich but stingy Italian businessman, neglects to hold when he finishes building his fantasy vacation residence on Naratrani. So tight-fisted is Senna that not even one zebu bull is slaughtered for the local villagers, not one festive step danced, not one glass of rum poured on the ground for thirsty ancestors when the last thatch has been laid on the big villa he constructed on Finawana Beach. And so the islanders, the fishermen, charcoal burners, cane workers, hotel maids, gardeners, mechanics, market vendors, prostitutes, wood carvers, middle-class shopkeepers, and professionals observed this neglect of the proprieties without rancor, but with a sense of inevitable consequences. Particularly the Sakalava feel this way. It is their island, and they are the abiding ones, the Taratani, residents essential to the place as volcanic bedrock, for generations washed over by the caprice and varied abuses of the Vazaha, as they call the foreigners who come and go on the land. These locals watch unsurprised as the Red House begins, even before it is furnished, to accumulate an evil atmosphere. It happens bit by bit, just as dust and litter build up in the corners of an unswept room. And finally, as is so often the case, it becomes a woman's job to clean things up.
Thank you, Andrea. That is a wonderful place to begin. And it kind of opens up the Q&A. And I think I'm going to start by asking you the first question. And since Shaun and I talk so much about Sarah Phillips, your first novel, and you have now just read from Red Island House, your most current novel, I'm wondering about the trajectory, the connections that have been made, that you've made as a writer over the years, how these books then begin to connect to each other, build on each other, or are different from each other. Can you just tell us a little bit about that journey from Sarah Phillips to Red Island?
Isn't it interesting? You know, where did I hear someone said that, or, writers spend so much of their time trying not to think about what they're doing as they do it. I think that everyone has a shape to their lives, and that you, as an artist, your work inevitably reflects that shape. And somehow, because of how I've lived, where I've lived, in choices I've made, of course, my writing has always been about someone being an outsider somewhere. And it started even before I went to the Baldwin School. My parents moved to Yeadon, Pennsylvania, a Black suburb in Philadelphia, where they were coming in to a very white area. They and their friends and colleagues were kind of integrating this suburb in the 50s. So I grew up in a changing neighborhood where we were outsiders, but they were very careful to try to create a 1960s kind of dream world. But we knew that we were surrounded by a world that maybe didn't accept us. So then to Baldwin I went, and my old school, I went and integrated the Baldwin School, and was an outsider there. And I began to be interested, and always have been interested in traveling, in living in different countries, in different societies. So I think it all connects, and all of my books are more or less about in some way being foreign, in some way being witness to or part of a collision of cultures. when I wrote my first book, Russian Journal, it had happened that I had gone to Russia, but not because I was studying Russia, because I had married a Russian scholar and began to write for the New Yorker from the Soviet Union, because it was still the Soviet Union in those days, the most alien place you could possibly imagine to me in some ways. And so but yet it's somehow the feeling of being an outsider felt at home. It felt like something I was used to there. When I was writing Russian Journal, I was also writing Sarah Phillips. I've said this in many interviews, actually, oddly enough. It came up in many a series of questions why I didn't mention in Russian Journal, for example, that I was an African American, except in one little, they said it was a surprise, some sort of surprise mention in the middle of the book. I didn't quite know how to do it when I was there. I was enough of an outsider as an American, as a young American woman when I was there. And I was confused as to how to insert the fact of being African American when I was there. So I was sitting in the Lenin Library, both writing Russian Journal and Sarah Phillips about my childhood as being a Black American living in a changing world. It was strange because those books are kind of a diptych, yet Sarah Phillips came out much after Russian Journal. But they were almost like the same book, two sides of an equation almost. It's an odd thing. And after that, I went to live in Europe and began to write about the experience of being an expatriate, which kind of, to me, flows on from being an African American. A Black person in America in some ways is always a foreigner, but yet we're the most American people who can be, practically. But there's always this sense that we are outside of what is approved of what the mainstream is. At least it used to be that way. So I think that it's always been the theme. My theme has always been being a foreigner, being an outsider. All of these books to me fit together. And it just seems like things are just constantly expanding. Madagascar is the farthest away from where I grew up that I've ever been. But oddly enough, there it was. And the themes just present themselves. And I can't describe it. I don't think of it consciously, but there it is. Those themes are always the same. As you were talking to me about servant problems, I thought, for the first time, I thought, my goodness, here I am writing in Red Island House about a close relationship that the heroine has with her housekeeper, a servant. But she's a servant who's actually much more powerful than Shay in many ways. So is that a development out of that first story about servants where Sarah Phillips runs away down the stairs? Now she's not running down the stairs. She's walking with Bertine and trying to find some sort of peace of mind with a woman who is essentially a servant. But yet at the same time, we know that Bertine is much, much more and a much higher rank than Shay is. So there are these themes that just continue on through my work. I think it all fits together.
Shaun?
I'll ask a question. Thank you so much for that. And you speaking of kind of the span of this outsider perspective, and you fully bring it to Red Island House. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit about what the writing process, the research for this rich, sweeping kind of view of Madagascar, which was all the more rewarding as we are all sheltering in place and quarantining, a bit of armchair travel. But if you could talk about the, I imagine, extended kind of process of putting this novel together.
Sure. Well, the book comes out of my kind of extended over the last 15 or 20 years, my extensive encounter with Madagascar. When I moved to Italy and married an Italian, this is who loved diving, who loved traveling. We began to travel around in the Indian Ocean, which is not quite as exotic as it seems from here because it's much closer. It's much more like maybe going to, going to Mexico or going to the Caribbean because it's closer to Europe and it's a popular vacation spot for a lot of Europeans. And we began to stop in at various islands. And I began to see this whole theme. Oh, hi, I just see someone. I began to see this whole theme of foreigners who have come to live in what they think of as paradise, in Paradise Islands, and those strange misadventures that they usually encounter in trying to pursue these, dreams of life, a perfect life in a tropical place. And I just saw so many, fascinating things that I kept storing away in my mind over the last 15 years. But I didn't really want to write about Madagascar. I felt that it was a place, and is a place, that required a great deal of respect, a great deal of knowledge and respect. It's an astonishing country. It's unbelievably beautiful. It's got a completely unique culture. It's got actually its own completely unique literature. It's got this very rich tradition that hasn't been translated into much, even into French. And it's completely unique and very, very, very unknown to people in the West in particular. And I thought it was disrespectful for me to come there on vacation, as we began to do, and stay in a hotel or rent a house, and then start to think about writing about Madagascar, because I thought it would take a great deal of devotion. But it was if I couldn't forget the stories I began to see of the strange mishaps that I saw among foreigners who decided to move there, who mingled with the Malagasy. I always had a feeling from the very beginning of my visits there, first of all, I realized as a Black American woman, you kind of think, oh, you're going to go to a country in Africa, and you'll just fit right in, because people kind of looked like people in my family there. So I just thought, but there is no connection. There was no connection, except for perhaps, as I say in one of the stories, the fact that they would have been discriminated against in Washington, D.C. if they were there, in the time of segregation. But other than that, there was a completely different culture that I knew nothing about and needed to understand and respect. And I didn't know very much about it. I wasn't studying it. I wasn't a scholar, but I kept on picking up more and more information, making friends. So I tried diligently to as Shay does, to kind of stay aloof. I also felt when I was there with groups of Europeans that there was a kind of pain in the air. I can't describe it, but it's as I said, this is one of the most unique and beautiful countries in the world, because it has its own wildlife that exists nowhere else, that's being killed off. It's a very, very poor country. It's kind of at the mercy of a lot of outside interests. So, but I always felt this deep pain in the air coming out of the earth. It sounds strange, but it was there, and I didn't know if I could possibly convey it, if I would respect it. I couldn't cure it, but I knew that something very serious was going on. But finally, I just began to write short stories about Madagascar. The first was the story that I read when I first met Mary Helen in Detroit, which is Brothers and Sisters Around the World, which is just a very short story about a woman's first idea that she can have a connection with women in Madagascar that somehow transcends language, that somehow transcends cultural values, and that she can feel this closeness to them. I don't think of it as a successful story, though it's a very popular story, especially now that I go back and I know so much more about the culture. I think, oh my God, you got the names of the ethnic groups wrong. You didn't, nothing is authentic to me in that story. But that was the first time, and that kind of opened a door for writing about Madagascar. And then I began just to write stories about it. It seemed like it had to happen. And for a while, they were a lot of short stories that were not connected in any way, except that they were about the misadventures of people that I saw at the islands, various parts of beach places in Madagascar, the big island, on small islands. I saw all sorts of situations where people were coming in trying to live some sort of paradisiacal life with the beautiful island boy, the beautiful island girl, somehow living in, doing what they wanted, except that it never worked out. It was always somehow disastrous. And so I began to jot down these stories, and they had different narrators and all sorts of things. Then I began to realize much later, when I first met, I think just after I met you, Mary Helen, that it has to be connected in some way. And that's when I invented Shay, who is partly me, but partly a lens through which we see foreigners in the foreign experience in Madagascar. So, and then it went from a random group of short stories into this narrative. And the whole time I was writing it, I was putting it together, I thought of it as Paradise Twisted. I called it that because it was so clear to me that for centuries, Madagascar has been a place in which people tried to come and take things and live in an ideal way. One of the first times that I was there, I saw a pizzeria run by Italians, but it had a pirate's head on it, and it was as on the sign, and it was called Libertalia. And I thought, well, what is that? And it turned out that there's a legend in Madagascar of this pirate colony from the 1600s that was founded in Madagascar by European pirates. And it was called Libertalia because they thought they had found a utopian place that they could do whatever they wanted. Beautiful women, they could get drunk all day long, they could do whatever they felt like in this tropical place where no one seemed to, where there were no laws, there were to be no laws. And of course, it lasted for a year or two, and then it was completely destroyed by the people who lived there, the Teratani. And no one knows if this is a legend or not, but it kind of hovers around especially the east coast of Madagascar. So that also inspired me. I mean, I thought, my goodness, everyone is always trying to come here and create something, to take something, and it never works out. And there's always this kind of power that overcomes them, and that became part of the basis for my story.
Well, I think you certainly do create a sense of that pain in Red Island House. When we were reading it together in a book group, everyone was very much aware of Madagascar, and I think we felt so drawn to it. And part of it was the way you completely immerse us in that culture. I'm thinking about the epigraphs in front of the chapters where you are using the poetry and the history written by people from Madagascar, the Malagasy people. So, we were very much taken with the way you made us aware of this culture. There's a question here, and I think I need to at least pull from one of the Q&As from Bob Crosley, a friend of mine who's read your work, and he says that your work makes him think of William Wordsworth, who said that poets are different from other people because they remember more. And he asked, can you speak a little bit about your writing process and how much inventing and remembering are connected as you work?
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, it's I'm always wondering about that myself. I think it's like an instinct, and strangely enough, my kids have it too. It's an instinct to take. I've done it my whole life because I've written poetry and stories since I could talk. I mean, it's kind of famous in my family for doing it. You take things that you see all the time. I'm seeing things all day long, always looking around, always inventing stories about someone who's walking by, about something I see, and maybe putting them together with something else that maybe I didn't see on the same day. So you take a lot of raw material that's real, that you witness, but then you can't say that you're writing nonfiction, because you're writing nonfiction, you have to be respectful of the actual events of the time and place. But when you're writing fiction, at least when I'm writing fiction, I'm very often taking things that I see, things that I hear, and putting them together in different configurations. because I think it would make it, because I think it tells a deeper truth. I don't know how to, it's more instinctive, what I think would be a good story, what I think I would like to read as a story. That's probably it, that what I think I would like to read. So there's a lot of truth in it, but it's not, otherwise I would be writing, like I would have written a memoir of Madagascar, but there's a lot in Red Island House. There's no red house, for example. I wanted the red house to be as kind of I've seen a lot of big houses, a lot of ambitious, ridiculous places built there, but I wanted it to be I don't want to say anything so crass as a symbol, but I wanted it to be kind of an emblem of human vanity, hubris, something a little tiny bit like the Tower of Babel, or something ridiculous, because I've seen so many ridiculous things built in places that are quote unquote unspoiled, before before I don't know, tourists or settlers come, and so I don't know, I took a lot of real things that I've seen and I build them together, I pile them together.
One of my favorite chapters is Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And part of the reason I love that chapter is that it's because of one word in the chapter, and it's the French word ici. And it's when the young Black woman, Bay, who I guess is a sex worker, comes to dinner with her Italian boyfriend, and Shay, the main character, asks her, "Where are you from?" Yes. And I love that you put it in French, because if it were in English, it wouldn't sound right. You'd have to say, "Oh, I'm from, here." She just says "isolé, ici," meaning, here, which is, a complete rejection of Shay, who actually doesn't belong there. And it was just a really interesting way in which, all the way through that novel, I think you make Shay question herself and question her motives, and question her positionality in relationship to this country that she really isn't a part of, but where she has so much more privilege than the people who actually live there.
Yeah. Oh, that's
so my question was about the way in which you continue to connect African-American cultural tropes. In a way, in this book, you do much more of that, of bringing in these African-American cultural allusions.
Yeah, I thought that, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I made Shay, and I feel like I didn't make Shay very expertly a professor of African-American literature, because I kept calling up my friends who actually were. I should have called you and said, would she have taught this, to a group, a first-year group of students in Milan. So I actually asked for a list of books, most of which of course I had read, but I've never taught them. So, so I thought it would be helpful in terms of contrasting, what, I didn't do it so consciously, but I thought it needed to be very, very clear that Shay, had an awareness of herself as an African-American woman, not just kind of like a businesswoman, but she had to have this because it just needed that contrast with actual, the point was, part of the book, a large part of the book is the growth of Shay in some ways. That's something that actually came much later. Shay, shows up and she's kind of there and she's sort of a tourist and she's a little bit frivolous, but she thinks that she's got everything together. She's very privileged, but she's also sort of politically correct. She's raising her kids to be aware of their heritage. She's married to her husband, but she thinks she's got everything in order. And then in Madagascar, she doesn't know where to look, what to think. She has to confront herself. She has to confront her own, her own helplessness in some ways in front of certain things. She doesn't know what to do with the fact that a prostitute, what she calls a prostitute, a sex worker, is coming to dinner to sit down at her table in that story. And the fact is also that her neighbors, some of whom are Black women or Black Malagasy women, are coming in and saying, "Oh no, don't let her sit down at your table." So it's she has to question her own values. She has to figure out what she's going to do on her own in that story. And she does. Finally, she realizes that nobody, especially a woman who, looks like someone in her family, can be disinvited to Shay's table. And so that is the story in which Shay kind of finally grows a backbone and begins to think, okay, I have to take things over. It's a turning point. It's a story I didn't like that much when I wrote it. It seemed kind of obvious to me. I didn't, it's my least favorite story in the book, but I go back and I think it's a turning point in the book because she is beginning to grow up and look at her privilege and look at her, look at herself as an individual who has to make individual decisions and, grow a moral spine.
Mm.
I wanted to ask, I was trying to check the Q&A, but I just wanted to ask, there's the video again. I'm wholly fascinated in the kind of history of Blacks in literary history, but as well as journalism history. And your story is so much a part of the history of Black work in periodicals. And I think I've written about it, but I think it's been understated, the ways in which you and Jamaica Kincaid and Charlene Hunter Galt integrated the New Yorker. You were doing this at the age of like 20 something, very young 20s. Could you talk a bit about your kind of long arc trajectory at the New Yorker and what it was like kind of to begin there?
Yeah, it was such a, even everything, so much in my life seems quite random. I feel like I've frozen too. Maybe I haven't. So much in my life seems sort of like it just kind of happened randomly. I began to work at the New Yorker, it seems almost by chance, because I was going to Russia and I had just gotten a master's in literature and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I would send out letters to various magazines saying, I'm going to Russia. Anybody want me to write about Russia? And nobody wanted me to write about Russia. I got rejections all over the place, except for one magazine, the New Yorker, which I almost didn't write to because I thought it was unthinkable. They wanted me to try out writing a diary. So it just kind of happened. It was such an odd thing. And when I came back from Russia, having published Russian journal in parts in the New Yorker, it all seemed like a miracle to me. I began to work I had a little office in the New Yorker building in New York because I had moved to New York City at that point. And there I used to see a girl scurrying by who looked like to me like a teenage, like a really young teenage Black girl. And I was like, who is that? I would just see her like flitting by, and it was Jamaica Kincaid. And she would like peer at me and I would peer at her, but we didn't, then we got to be friends and we would sneak off and like go shopping and gossip about other writers. We were like the young ones in this very old, dusty, because they were in the older building at that point, in this very old, dusty, kind of incredibly traditional place. And everybody liked us, but we felt like kids kind of playing, at least I did. I'm not sure how she felt, but it seemed as if we were almost children kind of, running around and enjoying ourselves. And occasionally, as I said, we would go shopping for clothes. She always had much better taste than I did. And I was very conventional and she was like totally downtown chic, even at that, very young age. And I don't know, there was no feeling of being outsiders at that point. I've spent my life being an outsider, but that, strangely enough, was a place that I felt completely at home, oddly enough, with kind of really ancient writers shuffling by who were all famous. But somehow it was, it just seemed like the place where I was going to be. And it seemed almost like home, oddly enough. I don't know what Jamaica would say. I've met up with her a couple of times and we just laughed about that period because we were really just, I don't know what we were doing all day long. A lot of the time we weren't writing, but I don't know. I think of it as a very enjoyable period of time after being at university, and I don't even know how it came about. So I'm laughing to think that it's considered sort of an important part in journalism because really, I didn't think of it as that at all.
We'll claim it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so much, but we'll talk about it another time maybe. But it really tickles me to think that you're interested in it.
Hi, I'd like to jump in and just thank all three of you, and to pose a final question as we look to round out this conversation and also round out our year together. And I'm not ready to let go of my distinguished university professor, colleague, Mary Helen Washington, though she is, her apotheosis is happening shortly. I'd like, this came about through Mary Helen. And I think it was Andrea, you having a connection with Mary Helen. And I learned about your work, Andrea, because I was at a conference and there was Mary Helen chairing a panel on your work. And there was a line of scholars, of Black women. And I want to kind of step back and really to think about Mary Helen and Shaun, who has this illustrious career. And I'd really like us to hear a little bit from Mary Helen and Shaun about the communities, the kind of intellectual scholarly communities that you have found and built through conversations about Lee, but also more generally. So if we could I want to pivot back a little bit so maybe Shaun, if you would go first, and Mary Helen, we'll let you have the last word. How about that?
Okay.
Yeah. Shaun?
When you speak about community, for me, in terms of scholarship, it begins at the University of Maryland and Mary Helen's classrooms, but also, I don't know if I should share this, but at your kitchen table. Like, this is like the community where the scholarship kind of is birthed. And I can't count the number of conversations that Mary Helen and I have had about Andrea Lee's work over many, many years. And I know that there was a way that we wanted to honor kind of that long relationship, that we felt with your work over many years. It captures so much, and I can't wait to kind of pass it on to my own daughter.
There's something about Andrea Lee's work that makes this scholarly community so easy. As soon as you begin to talk about integrating a school, you realize that all of us scholars, because I was a child of the 50s, this book resonated for me. And then Shaun said, well, I'm a child of the 70s, and it resonated for me. And then somebody else, well, I'm a child of the 80s. And so there's something in that experience that really calls forth these kinds of conversations. And, as I mentioned in my introduction, that Valerie Smith, who's now the president of Swarthmore, and I had this real argument over Sarah Phillips. And I'm saying this and she's saying this. And of course, eventually, I think we came to a kind of consensus. But that ended up with us talking to Richard Yarborough, who then put Sarah Phillips in the Northeastern University Press reprint series. And I think it's because these are subjects that really touch us. And even in Red Island House, I've never been to Madagascar, but I have seen the Indian Ocean, and it is gorgeous. And I'm hoping to come to Madagascar as soon as they let us get on a plane. But the connection I felt there was the way Andrea handled Shay Sinha. This is a woman who is questioning her relationship as a privileged woman to this world, as we are. So there's this kind of very personal way in which her work brings us in. And even though she hasn't talked about it, I really feel as though there's something that happened between Sarah Phillips and Red Island House, and it's there in this character of Shay, who now not only quotes from Madagascar writers, but is also talking a lot about African-American writers. Langston Hughes was just a little footnote in Sarah Phillips, but in Red Island House, there's a whole reference to his poem, I Too Sing America. And then Shaun said, how did Andrea Lee find out about Alice Childress and like one of the family? And of course, I immediately thought, oh, that's my writer. So she, there's a way in which certain writers make those connections easier for you.
I just have, I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to say that I'm actually working on the next book, and that is a book set in Philadelphia. Again, it's kind of returned to Sarah Phillips, but this is a memoir called Lincoln Went Down to the Nile, which is the Nile Swim Club. And it's all about, I don't know, I've seen Philadelphia in my childhood now as a foreign place. It's fascinating to me, as that Sarah Phillips didn't see. So I guess Sarah Phillips grew up at some point and kind of, and maybe you will see somebody similar to her, but a little bit more mature in this next book. So,
I look forward to this.
We all do.
I want to thank all of you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Andrea Lee. Thank you so much, Shaun Myers. And thank you so much, Helen Washington. And we're not letting go. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and lots of gratitude from the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies. All right. Thank you.